You may be seated. Kids may be dismissed to kids worship. And turn in your Bibles to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And let's read just the first 7 verses. And as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of a spittle and applied the clay to the eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went there and washed and came back seeing. Have you ever thought that life had just handed you a bad deal? I mean, think about this man. Born blind, only to be healed. Healed, only to be kicked out. Kicked out, only to be left alone. The peak of Everest and the heat of Sahara, all in one Sabbath. Now he can't even beg anymore. How would that feel? Well, maybe you've had some feelings similar. Maybe you know pain all too well. Maybe you've lost a child or a spouse. Maybe you have a child with special needs. Maybe you have heart trouble and complications that led to pneumonia. Do some people seem to have been dealt more than their share of bad hands? Well, today we want to focus on this blind man's story that we all know very well. But I want us to focus on this story, and so let's start with the beginning of the story. The disciples see this blind man sitting at the gate begging, and they ask him, who sinned, this man or his parents? Well, this man's blindness is more than just about physical blindness. This man's blindness is also about spiritual blindness. And as we go through the story, you'll see that even more clearly. Spiritual blindness or spiritual darkness is very real in this world. And yet, probably the closest thing I've ever experienced being blind is down in the caverns of a natural bridge, and they turn the lights out, and you can't even see your hand in front of your face. Okay? That's scary. That's the world this man lived in, blind. Not just physically, but also spiritually. The darkness is there. Spiritual darkness is very real in this world. While we were in India, they took us to a Hebrew temple. Ajay said he wanted us to go and experience the darkness. Huh? What did I say? I have a problem with saying doing that. A Hindu temple. Hindu temple. It's someplace I never want to go again. I'd rather go to a Hebrew temple, not a Hindu temple. But Ajay said he wanted us to experience the darkness. So we went to this Hindu temple. And this Hindu temple, their god that they're worshiping is Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva, there's a whole lot of myths about Lord Shiva, but basically what they were worshiping was a rock, a black rock. And on that black rock, they bring flowers, they bring vegetables, they pour milk all over this rock. The rock looked like a tiger more than it did a black rock, where they poured all this stuff over this rock, had all these flowers, and they had images of cobras and various things all around the rock that they were worshiping. Part of the worship in that temple, there were a couple of guys that had these drums that had little pieces of metal tied, so that they took the drum and they shook it this way, and the metal would beat on the drum and make loud noises. And then a couple other guys had these big metal plates, and to me it looked like a bone of some sort, banging on that plate. They had to make all that noise to wake Shiva up. I'm glad we serve a God that never sleeps. They had to wake him up. And then the priest, no one was allowed in the room with the rock except the priest. And he had an instrument he was holding in his hand was coals and smoke coming off those coals. And he just walked all around that room, shaking the smoke all around that rock. Then they closed the curtain. Then they had to make all that noise again for the second part of the worship of this rock. They'd open the curtain back up, and this time the priest had fire. And he was waving the fire all around the room, all around that rock. Where we were standing to witness all of this, there were bells over the top of our heads. And when the Hindu had their prayers answered, they were supposed to ring these bells. But I never heard the bells ring. Okay? Because there's only one God that can answer prayer, isn't it? I never heard the bells ring, except the guy demonstrating made them ring. Now, the guys that were doing those drums and all the people that were involved in that worship service, you could see the demonic presence, because the demons are what gives idols their power. The boys doing the drums, their eyes like roll back in their head, and their face, the countenance in their face just changed. You could tell they had been overtaken by the power of the demon as they were involved in this worship. And I mean, they shook those drums like you wouldn't believe. All right? So there was just a heaviness present. It's like something taking your breath away. Again, that's the presence of the demon. And that's one God that they worship in India out of 33 million. 33 million. So darkness is very prevalent in India. And we witnessed it. But spiritual blindness is not just in India. It's in the United States as well. Because anybody that doesn't know Jesus is spiritually blind. And maybe we don't worship idols in that fashion. And maybe we don't have idols made out of stone. But there are plenty of idols in this country. There are plenty of things that people worship. Money, power, pleasure. People after that kind of stuff. So there's spiritual blindness here too. But the question the disciples are asking is not as much about this man's spiritual blindness as his physical blindness. Who sinned? This man or his parents? Now again, in India, they believe that if you've got a problem like blindness, and we saw lots of kids at the blind and deaf and mute school, they believe that the Hindu people and most of the people in India, not the Christians, but most of the people in India, believe that they did something in a previous life that caused them to come back and be that way, And so you're not supposed to help them. You're supposed to just leave them. Let them fend for themselves because they're getting what they deserve. The disciples are asking a question similar to that. Who sinned, this man and his parents? Because the ancient Hebrews believed that you could sin in your mother's womb. And if you did sin in your mother's womb, you'd be born blind or some other affliction would happen to you. Or it could be that your parents did something that you're carrying the burden for, according to ancient Hebrew. And we all know how silly that is. But people believe that. And there are even some people today that still would tend to think that way a little bit. So we have to be careful. But Jesus' answer in John 9:3 says, it is not this man's sin or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed. So in John chapter 9 and verse 6, we see that Jesus spits on the ground and makes a little mud. So just let's try to paint the picture real good. All right, so Jesus said this man didn't sin nor his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed. And so now he's starting to work his mouth a little bit. All right, work the mouth around a little bit. And the onlookers are looking and saying, what on earth is he doing? And he moves his jaw like he's chewing on something. And then he chews and he rotates his jaw around until he had just what he wanted in his mouth. And he spits right down on the ground. And he bends down, he takes his finger and puts it in the middle of that spit and works it around until he's made a nice little mud pie. And then he takes that mud and spreads it on the blind man's eyes. Now, the blind man couldn't see. He definitely now not going to see a thing because he got mud pie all over his eyes. And everybody's saying, yeah, what did Jesus do that for? And in verse 7, Jesus gives him instructions. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, understand this. The man had a choice to make. He had this mud all over his eyes. Is he just going to leave it there? Is he just going to go home because Jesus put mud in his face? You know, is he going to be sore about it? Or is he going to do what Jesus said? To get up and go to the pool of Siloam. All Jesus told him was get up, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Jesus didn't promise him anything. But he got up and he went to the pool of Siloam. That's an interesting place. It was part of the water system that Hezekiah built in Jerusalem so that they would have clean water in Jerusalem. So the pool of Siloam was one of the few places they had clean water in the city of Jerusalem. The pool of Siloam can be translated as sent. The Greek word means to be sent, like sent on a mission. Well, he was sent on a mission, right? To go wash his eyes. But when he goes to wash his eyes, things are going to change physically and spiritually. The pool of Siloam was also known as the pool of the Messiah. Pool of the Messiah. It's interesting, Jesus started to go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Because this blind man didn't know who the Messiah was. But he's about to find out. So he goes to the pool and he washes, and when he comes back, he can see. He can see. Now, that has everybody confused. This is the man that had been sitting at the gate. All of his life he's been born, he was blind. Now he can see, and he's not begging at the gate anymore, but he's telling everybody he can see. And they want to know why. They start asking questions. And in verse 11, he said, the man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, and said, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went, and I received my sight. Not just the physical sight. But I want you to notice the progression of his faith as we continue looking at verses through this story. In verse 17, he says, so for they say to the blind man, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. Notice where he started. This man called Jesus. Now he says, oh, wait a minute, this man called Jesus, he's a prophet. And they said, oh, he's a sinner. In verse 25, he answered, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know, but I know one thing, though I was blind, now I see. And because the man kept giving them answers they didn't want to hear, they threw him out of the synagogue. And Jesus asked him, do you believe in the Messiah? The blind man says, well, who is he? Jesus says, I am. And he said, I believe and worship him. The progression of that man's faith. The man's sight is healed physically and spiritually. But see, when you come to Christ, and we saw a lot of this in India, when you come to Christ, there's persecution. There's always opposition. And so this man has to face opposition now that he has come to Christ. You see, some people doubt Christ's work not for the lack of evidence, but because they don't want to believe. Jesus' mission is often missed by the wise people of this world. And they're mad. Why are they mad? Not so much because the man's got his sight, but they're mad because Jesus made mud and put it on that man's eyes to heal him on the Sabbath. Now, get how ridiculous this really is. You could make mud and put on your eyes to rest on the Sabbath. But you can't make mud and put on somebody's eyes to heal them on the Sabbath. Talking about blindness. Talking about darkness. These are the religious leaders of that day during this time. And so they're mad at Jesus. So they want to know more about this thing. So in verses 21, 22, they call in this man's parents. Is this your son? Yeah, that's our son. Is he born blind? Yeah, he was born blind. He's been blind all of his life. Well, how does he see? We don't know. Now, wait a minute. If your child had been blind all of his life, and all of a sudden he could see, don't you think you would have asked him, how did this happen? I'm sure they did. But when the Pharisees want to know, how did this happen? We don't know. He's old enough, ask him. A lame excuse. All right? Lame excuse. Because why did they answer, we don't know? They were afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of being put out of the synagogue. We saw lots of Christians in India that have been disowned by their families because they converted from Hinduism to Christianity. We saw lots of Christians that are persecuted regularly because they gave up their tribal customs to follow Christianity. That's what this man's parents were afraid of, that they would be put out of the synagogue. And you have to understand, if you're put out of the synagogue, that means you can't buy or sell anything in the streets because nobody's going to have anything to do with it. If you can't buy or sell anything in this town that you're living in, how can you live there? And it means that you're going to have to move and go somewhere else where people don't know you and start over again. And that's not always easy. And so the parents were afraid. Let me tell you what, we saw some mighty brave Christians in India that were not afraid. They were not afraid to stand up. We were told the story of one preacher who was beaten and beaten and beaten, and as they were trying to make him sign a document renouncing Christ as the Savior, and he refused. And so they got tired of beating him, and they started beating his wife. And they beat her, and they beat her, and they beat her, and they beat her. And the whole time she was hollering at her husband, don't sign it. Don't sign it. Don't sign it. Yeah, we don't face that here. Thank you. Oh, we've got brothers and sisters who do. And they've got great courage to stand for Jesus Christ. And I wonder if we were in their place, how would we respond? How would we? It's so real. So the parents, to save their nephew, said, I don't know. So then it comes back to the name. Now they start asking him again, well, I done told him one time, boy, you want to be his disciple too? And their response is, well, wait a minute. We're disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but as for this man, Jesus, we don't know what he spoke. Now, isn't that interesting that they appealed to Moses? Because Moses wrote in Deuteronomy 18:15 that God would raise up a prophet like as Moses. If they had been familiar, like they thought they were, with their Old Testament scriptures, they should have recognized that Jesus was the prophet Moses told them about. But you see, they didn't want to recognize Jesus. They wanted to cling on to what they always had because they had power that way. They had control over the masses that way. And they said, we don't know who he is. We're disciples of Moses. The blind man just simply looks back and says, well, that's just amazing. You don't know where it comes from, but he heals the blind. And no one can heal the blind unless it comes from God. Well, they really didn't like the blind. What a stern rebuke he just gave them. They really don't care for him. And so they threw him out of the synagogue. But then we come to verse 35. And we find that this man is cherished by Jesus. Jesus heard they cast him out. And having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Notice Jesus went looking for him. Jesus heard they had thrown him out. Jesus went looking for him and found him and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? Remember, the blind man had never seen Jesus. Yeah, Jesus put the mud on his eyes. Jesus told him to go to the pool and wash. He never saw Jesus until now. Until now, when Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Lord, who is it? Who is it that I can believe? And Jesus says, I am. And he said, Lord, I believe. And Jesus replied, for judgment I came into this world that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said, are we also blind? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. They had physical eyesight, so they claimed they could see. But spiritually, they were blind, so their guilt remained. So what about the benefit of the blind man's journey in John chapter 1? Some people believe, some people don't. The blind man experienced a healing and went from blindness to seeing, both physically and spiritually. The Pharisees, they remained blind. Jesus said in John chapter 9, verse 5, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus is our light, and how we need to understand He is the light. That light gives light to the entire world. But Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 5, let your light so shine before men that they may see the good works. So let your light shine before men that they may see the good works. People need to be pointed to God. People need to see the light so that they can give glory to God. Jesus now is sitting on the throne in heaven. Expects us to be there. Let that light shine, let His light shine through us to light a dark world so that they can come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Helen Keller was blind and deaf. But because of her courage and her determination, she became a very famous woman. One day she had the privilege of meeting Mark Twain. Commenting on that day later, she said, I can feel the twinkle of his eye in his handshake. See, she was physically blind, but there was something in Mark Twain that she could see. Because in the handshake that he gave to her, she saw the twinkle in his eye. The man in John 9 was healed of physical blindness as well as spiritual blindness. What about us? And what do we face? What is it that we're dealing with? Do we use it to find God or blame God? Why don't we open our spiritual eyes and realize that Christ wants us to use whatever life has dealt to us to God's glory so that people will know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And so today, whatever it is that you may be dealing with, give it to God. Give it to Christ. Make Him Lord of your life. And let Him use whatever you're facing for God's glory. If you're here this morning, you have decisions to make for Jesus. What you call, Father, stand.